Well, joining me now is Maya Shankar. And Maya, what was, your blockbuster podcast, A Slight Change of Plans, really alludes to a major change of plans in your own life that sort of shaped your future in terms of behavioral science. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's great to chat with you, Chris. Always so much fun. So when I was 6 years old, my mom brought down my grandmother's violin that she had brought with her all the way from India when she immigrated to this country in the 70s. And my mom had only meant to show me the instrument, but I was so quickly taken by it that I very quickly asked for a pint-sized violin of my own. And so I began playing the violin at age 6, and very quickly I developed big dreams. And I auditioned successfully for the Juilliard School of Music when I was 9. And then when I was a teenager, Itzhak Perlman asked me to be his private violin student. And so this was such a crystallizing moment for me because I felt like, one of my idols in the space, was giving me that vote of confidence
So
that I
wait,
felt I
let's just
needed.
emphasize that for a second. Itzhak Perlman was taking you on, one of the greatest violinists in the history of music was taking you on as his student.
Yeah, it feels pretty unreal. I think actually later on, I asked his wife. I was like, technically speaking, I was a lot worse than my peers. Why did Perlman take me on when he did? And she said, well, I think he kind of liked your personality. I was like, okay, great. I got the personality card in the music world. But he said, I felt like she had something to say. And I think that's because at the end of the day, Chris, the thing that motivated me so much about the violin was human connection, right? Was being able in some way to translate what I was feeling inside into my instrument and to potentially make people feel something that they never felt before, even total strangers in a room. And so I was just completely enamored. I was so enamored by the instrument and being able to perform. And then I had my very unexpected slight change of plans. I was 15. I was studying at Perlman's summer music program, and I overstretched my finger on a single note. And doctors eventually told me that I could never play the violin again. So all those big dreams I had had for myself just came crashing down. And I felt a really profound loss of identity in that moment.
And so what led you then to neuroscience?
Yeah, so the summer before college, I was supposed to be in China touring with my musical classmates, and instead I was in Connecticut with my parents. Equally cool summer situation. And I was perusing their bookshelves, and I stumbled upon an old course book that my sister had had in college. It was Steven Pinker's The Language Instinct, which many people joining Nudgestock might be familiar with. And I remember opening the book, Chris, and not expecting very much, right? And instantly just being in awe of this organ that we all have, the brain. And he details the very sophisticated cognitive machinery that's operating behind the scenes that gives rise to our ability to comprehend and speak language. And up until that point, I had completely taken this ability for granted in myself. I never even thought twice about it. And so then when Pinker pulled the curtain back and showed me what was behind that, it just lit up my imagination. And I started asking myself questions like, well, if that's behind language, what's behind our ability to make complex decisions, or our ability to emotionally connect with other people, or what's behind falling in love, or asking grand philosophical questions? I mean, it just opened up this whole new world for me. And I'm so grateful for that moment. And by the way, I'm such a big fan of pop science books because they can really open the door for people who have never had exposure to a field, and light and totally spark this curiosity. But there's this concept in psychology called identity foreclosure, which refers to this idea that we can foreclose on an identity prematurely. This is certainly the case in adolescence, but research shows it can persist well into adulthood. And I had absolutely fallen prey to identity foreclosure at that moment. I was first and foremost a violinist. I had basically stopped exploring all the other identities that I could potentially embody. And so I remember feeling acutely that while I expected to grieve the loss of the instrument, I did not expect to grieve the loss of myself, which is ultimately what ended up happening. And so what I was forced to do in that moment was to try and see my identity as more malleable and to be open to other pursuits. And Steven Pinker's book gave me that lifeline to something else that could make me passionate. And I think one really important lesson I learned from this whole experience of navigating this slight change of plans and then so many other curveballs that life has thrown my way since, and that I'm hopeful is going to be helpful for people who are tuning into this, is we really care about having these sturdy identities in life, right? We often attach ourselves to very specific identities as we move through the world because it can give us this sense of security in a world that otherwise feels random. And what I learned from losing the violin at an early age is that it can be much more stable to attach our identities not to specific pursuits, like to being a violinist or being an astronaut or whatever it is that you attach yourself to, but instead to the features of that pursuit that really light you up. And so in discovering that the thing that made me tick in playing the violin was actually human connection, I was able to find that through line in so many pursuits following that, right? So I found it as a cognitive scientist who was studying the science of what it means to be human and to move about in this world. I found that human connection when I was working in the Obama White House and at the United Nations, working at the intersection of behavioral science and policy, where at their core, so many of these issues were so inherently human, and I was able to connect with people, on the ground in Flint, Michigan, after the lead and water crisis, talking with folks who've been recently incarcerated, talking with principals whose students were going hungry every day at school because they weren't getting access to the school lunch program. I mean, there was such a human component to that. And then today, with my podcast, A Slight Change of Plans, it is an excuse to go into a room with someone I've never met before, cut through all the pleasantries, and dig really deep about these transformative moments in their life that have changed them. And so I would urge everyone who's listening to ask themselves, like, what is my through line, right? When you strip away all the superficial features of the things that I do, what is still there? And I think that can make us more resilient in the face of change.
Now, Maya, earlier you referred to yourself with an identity noun. I was a violinist. And we know from behavioral science that, for example, in Get Out the Vote behavioral science, telling somebody they're a voter is more important than saying, go vote. It's that identity. But can identity serve as a barrier as well as a catalyst when you're looking for change?
Yeah, it's exactly as you said, Chris. So identity priming, it can absolutely be a double-edged sword. It can be used to good effect, like what we saw with the voter identity priming. I know that there was a research study run with the Red Cross in which they showed that if you simply remind people that in previous years they had been donors to the Red Cross, you're priming them for their status as charitable members of society. They're not only more likely to donate in subsequent years, but the magnitude of their donations actually increased. They became more charitable. And so we can absolutely see, social identity priming used for good. But there is a flip side to that, which is at these really critical junctures, at these critical inflection moments in life, sometimes people are wanting to depart from a prior identity. And those labels can hold them back because we know from research that people will act in ways that align with their social identities, either their current ones or their aspirational ones. And so if we label prematurely others or ourselves, it can hold us back. And so this was very salient in a partnership that we had. This was while I was in the Obama White House with the social and behavioral sciences team. We were partnering with the Department of Justice on a reentry guide for people who were leaving prison. And when we looked at the guide, we noticed that there were some harmful language that was being used in the guide, ex-prisoners, ex-convicts. That's holding people hostage to their past. And so what we did is we scrubbed the guide of backwards looking language in favor of forward looking language, like community members, job seekers, right? This is giving people that psychological chance to part from their past, inhabit a new identity moving forward, and actually act in ways that align with that.
So let's move to your podcast now, A Slight Change of Plans. It's a real hit. Tell us what you've learned at two different levels so far from your guests in terms of personal change, but then I want to turn the telescope around. There are many people who join Nudgestock who are looking at organizational change. They're taking their employees through a digital transformation, a pandemic transformation, a merger perhaps. So let's start with what you've learned on the personal side for individuals, And then let's turn it around to advice for those leading organizational change.
Yeah. So, Dan Gilbert introduced this idea that we are really bad cognitive forecasters back in the day, right? That we're bad at predicting the types of things that will make us happy or unhappy. And I found the exact same thing to be true in the area of change. We are bad cognitive forecasters when it comes to how the big changes in our lives will change us. And I think that's fundamentally because we have overly simplistic models of how change operates. When we think about how a change will affect us, we tend to think about the specific change itself, almost as though that change is operating in a vacuum. And so we think about the most obvious things that might result from that change. But that fails to appreciate that our lives and our psychologies are very complex, and change in one area of life can have lots of unexpected spillover effects in other areas of our lives that are hard to predict. And so what I've learned from my guests on A Slight Change of Plans, and again, they have stories that, cut across the full range of the human experience, is that there's this underlying universality to their experience, which is they surprise themselves in just how complex the outcome of a change was. Changes that they initially coded as exclusively bad turned out to have much more nuanced and multifaceted effects on them. And changes that they exclusively coded as good were much more complex at the end of the day and had some negative consequences. And so I think what I've learned overall from making this show is that, while I might have been tempted to give different advice to a person who is going through an expected change, a willed change, and an unexpected change, an unwilled change, now I feel very differently about that. I feel like I would give the same advice, which would be to approach change with a profound amount of humility, and to audit oneself during the change, to look for ways that we might be changing even outside of our conscious awareness as a result of the exogenous event that's happening in our lives.
If you look at, let's say that you're now leading transformation at a large company, to what degree do you need to first take on board the difference of the individuals there? For example, a loose versus tight culture, or whether somebody's more wired with a prevention regulatory focus versus promotion. Because behavioral economics and nudges for the longest time have been treating us as a species and less as individuals. And what are you discovering in change that makes it easier or harder for individuals, and then for a corporation to understand that and have perhaps a multifaceted approach to organizational change?
Yeah, I mean, there are, of course, going to be differences at the individual level. In the domain of change, I think what's been very reassuring for me and also makes organizational changes more feasible, because it's very hard to accommodate for these idiosyncrasies in large organizations, is that while people's change stories look very different on their surface, I mean, in A Slight Change of Plans, we hear from a Black jazz musician who ends up convincing dozens of members of the Ku Klux Klan to leave the Klan. We hear from a 30-something health nut who gets a stage 4 cancer diagnosis in the middle of quarantine and suddenly loses his identity as a fit person and gets his leg amputated below the knee. We hear from a woman who ends up going blind in her 20s and then goes on to win MasterChef. And then we hear from notables like Hillary Clinton and Amanda Knox and Tiffany Haddish about these turning points in their lives. And again, on the surface, you would think, how could I possibly learn very much from this person who's not at all like me, who has lived a very different life than I have? But what I found is that the psychological strategies that people use to navigate change are actually quite similar, which is actually a very reassuring message, because it means that we can learn from people's stories that don't look exactly like ours. And that's been reassuring for me at a time when we are experiencing unprecedented change. A motivation for me in starting A Slight Change of Plans in the first place was feeling completely overwhelmed by what 2020 was throwing our way and being intimidated by the specifics of what 2020 was throwing our way. But then I made sure to put on my cognitive science hat and realize, okay, while the specifics of this situation may in fact be unprecedented, our human ability to navigate change is absolutely not unprecedented. We as a species have done this change rodeo so many times before. It's a feature of what it means to be human to know how to navigate change. And so I remember thinking in that moment, okay, well, this is great news, because what this means fundamentally is that even though I do feel unprepared by the specifics of what I'm being thrown in this moment, I can learn, I can mine other people's stories, I can mine the science for wisdom about how I can successfully navigate this moment.
Maya, you've probably seen the Lowenstein news study where he does a bit of soul searching and reflection on nudging and behavioral economics. And it presents us a bit of tension for us all in this field, because he says, listen, there's the individual and then there's the big systemic fix. And really, the systemic fix has the greatest impact if you're thinking about existential threats like climate change, for example, or maybe even gun violence. And therefore, by focusing on individuals, maybe we're focusing on the wrong thing. Now, you've worked in both public sector and private sector. What do you make of this?
Yeah, I think it highlights an interesting tension. And I saw this play out during my time in the Obama White House. One of the projects that we were interested in working on was with the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, so formerly known as food stamps. And what the research was showing is that when you deliver the benefit at the beginning of the month in a one-time payment, you find that by the end of the month, emergency room visits increase, health outcomes decrease, disciplinary actions at school increase. And so there's an issue of smoothing consumption over the course of the month. And so behavioral economists would propose, hey, maybe you should actually make it a biweekly benefit to help smooth consumption. So you're giving them the benefit, twice a month, and that helps to even consumption. The issue when we started to bring this proposal to different members of the DC community is that we heard from a lot of advocates, activists in this space, that the overall sum that we are giving as part of this supplemental nutrition assistance program was simply not high enough. And so the challenge there is that if we were to try and optimize using this behavioral nudge, the delivery of this benefit, then it might be obfuscating a much larger issue, which was that people were not getting paid a sufficient amount to live comfortably. And so that was a moment where my teammates and I had to back off and realize, yeah, you know what? The bigger fight here is actually just getting the overall amount increase of the program. Then we can work on optimally designing it. But there's a fundamental need that has to be met first.
And then finally, very briefly, in all of the amazing guests you've had on your podcast, A Slight Change of Plans, what has surprised you most?
Oh, that's a great question. I'll just end with a personal story, which is while I was recording season 2 of A Slight Change of Plans, my husband and I were thrown our slight change of plans. We had a miscarriage with our surrogate for a second time. This time we lost identical twin girls to a miscarriage. And I remember just being so devastated and again, so humbled by that moment, because as someone who, has dug into the science of change, who was listening to all these stories from my guests, I felt again unprepared at that moment and was so unsure about how to process this experience and how to grieve. And what I ended up doing was asking my producer if he would interview me as a guest on my own show so that I could process my change experience out loud and try and make sense of it. And I found that to be a deeply therapeutic experience for me to process this change out loud and try and blend what I knew from the science with my own personal life in that moment, and found it to be a very healing experience. And so on a personal level, that's what surprised me the most, because I never, ever expected to bring such a personal side of me to this show. And then I thought to myself, well, you've asked this of all of your guests, and you yourself need to be willing to do this too. And since then, I've just heard from, so many people from all over the world who have shared how that episode in some way helped them. And that was a huge silver lining for me. I heard from a mother recently who had lost her 21-year-old son to a drug overdose. And she said it was in sharing my story that it helped unlock healing for her and helped her see the loss differently, helped her see her relationship with her son differently. And I just can't imagine a more powerful, way to have, being able to turn what was otherwise just heartbreak into something potentially helpful to the world.
Maya, thanks so much for that. And that's probably a great technique for all of us at an individual level, but maybe even at an organizational level, to actually go through the process out loud rather than in quiet introspection. Maya Shankar, creator of A Slight Change of Plans podcast with an amazing array of guests. Go check it out. Maya, thanks so much for joining us today on Nudgestock.
Thanks for so much for having me, Chris.
Just one favour. If you want to keep Nudgestock free, click the like button because the algorithm likes it, and click the subscribe button too. The algorithm likes that, and unlike the like button, it's actually useful because you'll get notified of future content from Nudgestock whenever it becomes available.